Thank you so much for participating, Dr. Harapnuik. At this time, I'm going to pass it to Colby Clifford, where she's going to start with our questions for this session.
And I'm already going to move the order of them. So I wanted to start with a question I have about the ePortfolio as a transfer object. I started this line of questioning on my own when I was reading Paper's book, and he uses coding, or used coding, as a way to, in an informal way, teach his kids about math. And then the object in his coding programs was a turtle. And then that became a transfer object for the kids to understand math better. I'm probably not doing justice to his research at all, but that led me to think about, what if in reading his book, I replaced the word turtle with ePortfolio? So in what ways can we, in an informal way, teach our students with the ePortfolio, and that then be a transfer object for everything else that they learn? That's something that I am really interested in researching, and I wanted to know what your thoughts are on that.
I was interested in the question, and I was wondering if you were going to use something like Paper's example of the coding. And I see the transfer because you can use coding and things like that for critical analytical thinking, design thinking, a variety of other things. And so, that methodology transfers to a lot of other things. Before I answer your question, I want one little clarification. How do you see the ePortfolio as a transfer object, and in what capacity?
Are you going to do this the whole time?
No. Well, so my philosophical background is I've got to get clear on terms, because my response is I don't think it is a transfer object. Okay. But then again, I might have a different perspective. So I just want to clarify how you see it as a transfer object, and then maybe from your perspective, I might be able to agree or say, I see what you're saying, but I look at it from this perspective. Does that help?
So yes, thank you. I'm wondering if, because the ePortfolio is an invitation to intentionally construct something, whether it's a concise reply to a book as like a reading response, or like a collection of reading responses, or an opportunity, an invitation to create some sort of digital representation of something that they're learning in class collaboratively, that invitation to do that, and that terrain of making that happen, then opens the door for taking that skill of construction to understanding a book better on their own, or coming up with the methodology of creating some sort of digital artifact on their own. So like the experience, the collaboration, the self-reflection that happens when you're constructing an ePortfolio, then they take that skill that they learned elsewhere.
Okay, I see. You're using the notion of transfer in the sense that by writing about a story, aggregating ideas, curating ideas, organizing ideas in the ePortfolio for an assignment, well, guess what? The next time that an individual is doing something in another area, they'll be able to do the same thing. That's your focus on transfer. In that regard, yes, I think an ePortfolio does function as a transfer object. I wouldn't necessarily say it's an object, but what I would say that it is a transfer device or process or mechanism, in the sense that it puts you in this state or capacity where you go through this type of thinking, where you take something apart, you analyze it, you evaluate it, and then you put it back together in a different way and apply it to what it is that you're doing. So what you're really talking about, I think, is, how is the ePortfolio a tool for higher order thinking? Might be an even better perspective, because it really puts a person in that state where they move away from observation and recognition and maybe even application into that evaluation, right? So if you look at Bloom's taxonomy, you're automatically in that higher level. And evaluation is a tough thing to do. Most people don't know how to do themselves. How do you decide what you're going to put in your ePortfolio? Where does it go? How does it fit? How do you make it fit? How do you connect it to these other things? All of these things are part of evaluation, and they're part of analysis, because in order to determine where you're going to put those pieces and how they fit, you have to analyze what is already there and what is new thing that's coming in. So it's not so much an object, but it might be maybe a place, a locatedness, or a place where you go through this process, and, or an object. I think that's okay. The more I talk about it, I'm thinking, Harapnuik, loosen up your definition. It could be an object too. Yeah, it is a thing. It is a thing. So it's a wonderful tool that helps people think deeper at that higher order. It's extremely important, and it's something that we don't see a lot of today. And if we can establish that tool, I think of Brianna's circumstances with kindergarten, 1, 2, like elementary. If we can get kids analyzing, evaluating, taking things apart, putting them back together, and they get used to doing that, I don't have to look beyond what has happened with my own 2 boys who have spent their entire life doing this. And now as they're older and they're looking at, their careers and making shifts in their careers and adding different things, well, guess what? They're looking at the opportunities of the world around us. Okay, everything's changed this last couple of years, because of COVID and variety of other things. Everything has changed, and both of my boys are going, well, because of this and this and this is happening, I need to adjust here. And because, for example, my younger son is facing a serious problem with supply issues and quality control, and a lot of the products he uses for his business are horrible. And so he's finding he's having to adjust and shift, and he's thinking, I can't sustain this, I've got to do something else. And so evaluation, analysis, and that had its roots when he was a younger child, always doing those types of things. So yes, an ePortfolio is a place or an object or a tool where you can further that type of practice of transfer. Does that answer your question?
Yes,
finally?
And it answers number 1, I think. My first question was how the learning that happens in an ePortfolio connects with taxonomies of learning. So before I let Allison start with her questions, do I have an incorrect understanding of the term transfer object and where Paper was going with it? Is there like a more academic definition of it that I'm not understanding?
No. What I found over the years is that depending on the region and depending on how the definitions are used, there could be subtleties, and I just want clarification. So this is a humorous explanation, but I'm up here in Canada, and we refer to Coke as Coke and Pepsi as Pepsi, right? And they're not sodas, they are beverages, right? Now, when I was living in Texas, I was offered, would you like a Coke? Oh, sure. No, do you have anything else? Well, we've got Coke this, Coke that. Coke was sort of a general term. They also, some people called, soda, pop, and people up north call it pop. So depending on where you're at, there's different definitions. And so one of the things that I found is that unless I get really, really clear, I don't want to disagree with somebody simply because I have a slightly different perspective. And in the back of my mind, yeah, you know what? You got Sprite Coke, you got Dr. Pepper Coke. Well, it's all pop, it's sugar water. So just as long as we're clear on the key idea, then we're okay. Does that help? My philosophical training, it's always about definition terms. Get clear on what your starting points are, and then it helps.
I don't want to be, I learned this from Pepper, this transfer object, and I actually don't know what I'm talking about. So I would appreciate the clarity as well.
Yeah, and then you know what? We are facing an issue right now in education of this idea of competency-based education. A lot of people use the label of competency-based education, and they think it's outcomes-based education. They want to move away from the traditional behaviors method, and yeah, we're going to go to competency-based education. So you want to measure skills, knowledge, and abilities? That's exactly what we do right now. No. We want to measure the outcomes. Oh, you want to do outcomes-based education? No. We want to do competency-based. Do you see the challenge we're running into? If we label things incorrectly, before you know it, these bad labels have a way of getting in the way of our making meaning and coming to a general consensus and understanding. And so that's a beautiful thing about what we're doing here in these types of discussions. Guess what? We clarify. We get clear on these ideas, and then that way, everybody is going to understand where everybody's coming from. It's not a matter of misunderstanding Papert or what you've read. It's just making sure that we're all on that same page, that same starting point.
Very good. Well, one of the questions I had, and something that I've really started to become more interested in, is how the ePortfolio could be used as a tool for formative assessment. So I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on using ePortfolios as formative assessments?
Formative assessment. Now, I have to be careful here. I'm going to provide you my definition. I'm not going to ask you, because I've been looking at this notion of assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. And so the assessment of learning, tests, papers, assignments, you sort of measure, that's a summative assessment. Assessment for learning is much more formative in the sense that it is helping, shaping, and moving. So it's an assessment of interactions, collaboration. It's assessment that is not necessarily graded, but it allows people to be directed in a certain way or area, right? So that's assessment for learning. And assessment as learning is that self-assessment piece. And I would suggest that the ePortfolio can be a wonderful, wonderful tool if we bring people together to provide that formative feedback. So I try to combine that in the courses that I teach. And when you get feedback from me, you've got a video feedback, you're showing me your results of your activities in your assignment. And my priority is to identify what's working and say, listen, you've got a wonderful foundation. You've got, these two terms of your vital behaviors are really, really good, but sometimes more isn't better. If you were to clarify and really focus on perhaps the integration of the curriculum piece of the vital behavior, and then when you're talking about collaboration, don't forget the accountability piece. And then that way, when you move these ideas forward, your group will benefit. So I'm taking, even when I do some of the assessment, I incorporate formative assessment into what I'm doing. And the beautiful thing is, as you've experienced in this program, everything you do is in your in your ePortfolio. So the ePortfolio becomes this wonderful starting point for me to coach, to guide, and direct. Now, guess what? Is it just me? No, you folks are involved in communities of practice here. You folks have a learning community. And guess what? You are commenting, sharing, helping each other out. There is much more formative assessment going on between yourselves and the people in your learning communities than there is from me. And that is as important, and I would say sometimes even more important than what you're getting from the instructor. So this ePortfolio becomes this amazing, wonderful digital tool that is easy to share. If necessary, you can do it in an asynchronous fashion. You can put comments down. You can put comments down and provide that formative assessment in the form of comments. It doesn't even have to be real time. So the ePortfolio can be a wonderful, wonderful tool. I do have a caution. And that is, administrators are looking at, oh, wow, we've already got this tool that you're using for formative assessment. Well, why don't we just sort of add a little bit of summative assessment in here, and then we'll make it all that much better. And before you know it, you've got this wonderful learning tool that emphasizes formative assessment and assessment as learning, because as a person who is growing and thinking, you're constantly looking at your work. I don't know if you're like me, but you wrote something a year ago, you go back and look at it and go, oh my gosh, how did I let this exist for so long? I've got to fix this. So you spend a couple of days fixing an old post. Oh, well, instead of just fixing it, I think I have to write a whole new post. And then you end up going down another avenue and building on that, right? And so that assessment as learning piece comes out, and that's your ePortfolio. It's live, it's dynamic, it's real, it's available, it's accessible, and it isn't just you, it's part of you and your learning community. So I think it's a wonderful tool if we keep it in that realm of the learning assessment, and we try to fight off the tendency to use it as a summative assessment tool. I've managed to control my impulses to use it as a summative assessment tool in the program you are in, simply because I work at it very, very hard. But there are times when I've got 40 assignments to grade, tonight, where I'm going to go, oh man, why don't I just automate this? Oh, Harapnuik, you're working too hard, right? So it's easy to slip into that notion of turning it into more of a summative tool, and then taking away its power and its impact. Does that help? Did I kind of answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I'm a math teacher. And so with the ePortfolio, what I really want to do is offer them choices in how they're assessed. Like instead of giving them a weekly quiz, which is easy for me to grade, but it doesn't really give me a clear understanding of what they know and don't know, but offering them choices where they can then put that on their ePortfolio and explain to me how they've shown that they know that information. And so kind of combining a more choice-based assignment with a reflection so I can see, are they really learning it? Because if you don't really know the material, you're not going to be able to produce that kind of assignment. And I think that the ePortfolio has shown me that that would be a really good tool to kind of do that sort of thing. So
I agree. I think it's a wonderful tool to do that. Now, I have a question. How is it going getting some of your colleagues to adopt the same methodology? Are they willing to spend the time and extra effort that it takes to use this wonderful tool as a formative assessment tool? Because so you're allowing students to choose different things. I mean, not everything's the same. You can't just sort of check off a few boxes. Isn't that more work?
yeah.
So how are you dealing with that?
When that idea was first presented to a few of my colleagues, some of the examples I gave were that of like Flipgrid. They could create a Flipgrid explaining a math problem, or they could write a paragraph explaining the method they used, or something similar to one of those options. And their exact comment was, I don't want to have to grade, 50 Flipgrids, 50 paragraphs. But I figure lead by example. So if I can do it and show them that it's working and it's producing more well-rounded, educated students, then maybe they'll get on board with it in the end anyway. Because that specific colleague of mine is actually in a program at Lamar and is now talking about ePortfolios all the time in whatever class they are in. So, it's coming full circle, I guess.
Cool. That's great. A lot of these ideas that we're talking about, especially when it comes to ePortfolios, the literature is clear. Everybody is clear on the benefits. Nobody disputes what potentially we can do. It's the actual implementation and realizing it that's hard, because we live in a system that is so tuned to the summative, and not just summative, but a very, very constrained competency-based information transfer type model that's easy to check off a few things. The reason that we have all this standardized testing we do is that it's easier to grade, and people are busy. And if you can get 80-90% effectiveness in terms of showing whether or not a student can regurgitate information, and that's all the state requires, hey, that's efficient. So there's a tendency to go there. And I agree that hopefully by modeling it and demonstrating it like you are choosing to do so, that others will pick that up. I commend you on that, and one of the reasons that I encourage everybody to be part of a learning community is because you delusional optimists have to stick together and encourage each other, because when you're busy and sometimes you need your colleagues to remind you that, yeah, it's not about me, it's about the kids, it's about the learner, it's about helping them grow. And it's these subtle little things. If I can impact these kids in a significant way, what, math can change people's lives. Math explains how the world works, and if a kid, and we know this is clear from the research, if a kid understands how the math works, and it's more than just plugging numbers into a formula, but they can understand how it works, you can't take away. You don't take that away from them, and it's something that they can build on. So what you're doing is you're building depth, deeper thinking, and so yeah, that's great. And the ePortfolio can be a wonderful tool, and that is actually maybe one of your arguments to say, well, this is one way we can actually save some time, and get some of the peer peers involved and have some of the kids involved in evaluating and grading. And there's some things and you're thinking, oh, that explains why Dr. Harapnuik is always having us evaluate each other's work. Yeah, it saves me time, but at the same time, it helps you become a better evaluator of your work and others' work, right? And so as you can help others, that's helping yourself. And then as you work together, so there is a little bit of a method to the procedure. It isn't just that I'm lazy, although guilty as charged most often. So yes, ePortfolios, phenomenal tool. Tough to actually implement, and I'm excited to see that in math. Normally, Colby, you're the humanities side or English, right? And we often say English and social and things like that. Most math instructors aren't willing to go down that path. So you're really breaking new ground, and I think it's wonderful.
Well, Colby, I don't know if you want to go ahead and move on to your next question, or if you don't mind me asking mine. It's up to you.
Will you go ahead and I'll end with the ePortfolio as self-assessment.
Yeah. Okay. So Dr. H, my other question that I wanted to ask you was if you think that constructing ePortfolios could have a positive effect on standardized testing, because we all know STAR testing isn't going away. So my thoughts were that using ePortfolios as a formative assessment and creating those deeper understandings of how math works could lead to higher standardized test scores, because if you can understand how it works, it doesn't matter what problem you're presented, you could still solve it.
Okay, so when you ask me that question, my first response is the best way to practice for a standardized or do well in standardized tests is to practice a standardized test. That's my first response, and I recognize that. But as you were talking about that, the more reasonable part of me is going, well, I think what she's referring to is interleave practice and then comparing apples to oranges. And so by asking students to use their ePortfolio as a place where they look at problems from a different perspective, and they do a bit of an interleave practice where they do things in a different way, or they look at different aspects of a problem, yeah, I think that can help students with improving scores potentially. Getting them to do that in the time constraints that you face, I think would be challenging. Also, if you look at the literature, we do know, not from direct actual peer-reviewed study of what you're talking about, but more of an inference or a transference, a generalization from other studies, that this should prove to be the case. But again, the challenge you face is a time, and helping students utilize that type of higher order thinking. What you are talking about is really asking students to move into a higher order level of thinking, to be able to use this tool to do that metacognitive reflection, to look at things in a different way. And that could be somewhat challenging. I think you can get students there, but it'll take a bit of work. I think you can. And I actually do something similar to my students in the DLL and the ADL programs. As you're going along, you are reflecting on your experiences at the end of each week, at the last week of each course. And in the capstone course, you are going back and you're looking at this whole process of what you've done, and you're doing an analysis. And not only are you doing analysis, but you'll see when you do the capstone course, you're going to be doing a creation of a synthesis that brings all the pieces together. And so if you were to go and write an exam and be tested on a variety of learning theories or a variety of procedures and things like that, you'd probably do quite well, even though you haven't actually been practicing those types of things. So it can be good. The only challenge you really face is that most standardized testing, depending on the region you're in, is often much more information-based as opposed to application-based. And the reason I mentioned this is that I had an opportunity with my older son, who was racing, downhill racing, and I was helping him with his last year of high school. So up here in Canada, it's called Social 30. So his grade 12 social. And this is in the course of study that he was on. We're looking at things like individualism, collectivism, the period of time from the Renaissance up until the modern day, and all the things that have changed the way the world works, economies. Why do people make the decisions they make? Phenomenal stuff. And I remember looking at the textbook and looking at the ideas, and this is wonderful. I get to work with my son, and we're going to explore life's most fundamental questions. How did we get to where we are now? What events in history precipitated different changes? Absolutely phenomenal. And we had actually a great time exploring and reading and talking. And then I got a copy of his practice exam for his final test. Dates, obscure information that had no relevance to what we were learning. And when I showed him that, his response to me was, "Oh, Dad, what is this? It's like it's a totally different course. Like that means I'm going to have to do a whole other course of study to be able to memorize all this stuff. Why don't they just ask the really important questions like what we were exploring?" So that's one of the challenges you face, is that with standardized testing, you're constrained by the easy stuff that is easy to systematize and to put into a multiple choice question. And also, what is the genre or the flavor of the day, right? So if you were to take a look at standardized testing today, from 3 years ago, there's going to be a whole bunch of COVID ramifications that you're going to see that you wouldn't have seen 3 years ago, right? So the flavor of the day is going to influence the testing. Whereas when you're dealing with something more foundational, like the deeper learning that comes from the application of that formative assessment and that personal evaluation, self-evaluation you have in your portfolio, that deeper learning, it isn't so subjected to the flavor of the day. It just helps you understand where that flavor of the day came from, right? So if you've got that deeper capacity, like my son is able to now, when he looks at different political events, he'll go, "Oh wow, that something like that happened back then, didn't it, Dad?" yeah, you're right. So great potential, but I don't see it being realized. That's one area I'm still going to defer to. Practice the standardized test if you want students to do well on the standardized test. Now, here's one more thing, and now I have a chance to sort of go off on my little tangent. What I would suggest, we need to get really, really, really good on helping kids to practice for the test, the serious study skills, right? The 5 key foundational study skills you see in that what works, what doesn't article, making sure they're not underlined, you're rereading, making sure they're doing self-testing, interleave practice, apples and oranges, distribution over time, like all those key fundamentals, getting really, really good at doing that. That would take a fraction of the time that we spend now. And then you've got all this extra time to do all the good stuff that we're talking about. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was explaining to my teacher when I was my colleague when I was telling them this was, if we can get the kids to a deeper understanding, teaching them how to take a test is the easy part. I feel like, you can teach them to rule out 2 answers all the time and learn how to use cubes to circle, underline, evaluate, and then come up with a way to solve. And the big thing now is STAR is actually changing in Texas. So they are completely redoing the way the test is formatted. Instead of multiple choice, it's going to be a lot of written response, fill in the blank, a lot more critical thinking skills are required for that, which is why I was started to think of the ePortfolio as a great way to lead to those skills and create those deeper understandings. But I definitely see where you're coming from with the standardized testing, because it is different. It's different than, how we start to think now. The STAR test is something completely different.
That is. Now, so I'm glad to hear that they're putting in different types of questions. Now, as my gray hair will attest to, with standardized testing, this is just this current cycle, because you'll have, we need to have kids think a little bit deeper. Okay, well long form questions, and so it'll go there. Now, guess what? For the next 2 or 3 cycles that they're going to do that, do you know what the biggest complaint of marking the STAR test will be? The time that it takes to mark those long answer questions, and kids can't write. That writing is horrible. We can't do that, right? So let's just go back to the multiple choice, right? Do you know how many times I've seen this in the last 30 years? So yeah, I've been there, done that, and hopefully it sticks this time. But we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
Well, that leads kind of into my last question in this segment. And you mentioned a minute ago our 5320 capstone course, and that we will be reflecting on the entire program and synthesizing what we've learned, and self-reflecting. And I was wondering, in the research class that I'm taking right now, I found a really great article on some research that another professor in Toronto has done. And she included I am statements in her research, wondering if her grad students saw themselves differently as learners before and after. And that's a really interesting concept to me. And I'm wondering how I can apply that to my middle school students. And then an offshoot of that question is, have you ever seen those being completely inaccurate? And if that matters.
Oh, good questions here. You're probably going to have to remind me to answer that last part about the inaccuracy about the IM. I have seen that. Now, this can work very, very well, and I've seen this done in a variety of different contexts. I've seen this done with undergraduate students. One of their first activities is to sort of come up with a whole IM video, and then they reflect on it in their third year, and then they reflect on it again in their fourth year. So I've seen this happen at a variety of different levels. I have seen this in different programs. I've experimented with myself in a few areas. And this is a wonderful way to get people to start to take a look at who they are, where they are. Okay, who am I? Where am I going? What is it going to take to get there? And then how far along am I? Right? And not a lot of people are asked to do that. So it's a wonderful tool. It's a wonderful tool. And I'm glad to see that you see how it can be quite useful. It's challenging to use though, because it is extremely subjective. Now, does this make it inaccurate? Does it make it unreliable? No, not necessarily, because a lot of factors come into play when a person is learning and growing and developing. And recognition of change over time, and recognition of where you started and where you are now, and then what happened along the journey, is recognition that learning is this continual ongoing growth process, and it's very, very personal. And is it right or is it wrong? Well, nobody can tell but you, because it's your journey. And that's the exciting part. I think it's very, very empowering. And I think it helps students to recognize that it's their learning journey. And this is something that I am asking all the students in the ADL program to do, to recognize that this is your journey. Now, I don't use these types of statements in the program, or do I? Or do I? If you think about one of the first courses that you have undertaken, you write a learning manifesto. Okay. And then in another course, you actually go back to that learning manifesto and then apply some aspects of what really is my learning philosophy. Why am I doing the things that I'm doing? Okay. And then in another course, or another part of a course, you apply your learning philosophy to how you're going to build instruction. So I think this I am idea is a wonderful way to help with that deeper analytical thinking. And it's a wonderful, wonderful tool. It isn't used enough because, and this will answer the second part of the question that I think you asked, is that how do you measure it? How do you measure it in a traditional systemic way, or a systematic fashion? I shouldn't say systematic, right? How do you measure it? Because it's your personal journey. And this is where things like the ePortfolio that we're talking about, that personal reflection, okay? So why am I always asking you to think about your journey, right? Even from the start of the course to, the 8th or 9th week. Just think of what happened. Just think of what you thought at the beginning and where you are now. And now also look back, look what you built, look what you created, look what you wrote, look what you're going to be able to share with other people. Now, how does that change you? How does that change your identity? How does that change you as an instructor? Have you grown, right? So there is that I am component in almost anything that we do that has that personal reflective component. The reflective practitioner component, I think, is extremely important. Wonderful tool. Wonderful tool. I would suggest that for middle school, high school, I think middle school would be perfect. Middle school and high school, it's perfect. Actually, and even younger kids, I want to be a fireman, right? I want to be, kids have an identity that they're playing around with, right? So yes, and then maybe have them do an I statement in grade 2, and then in grade 4, where are they? Grade 6, and then can you imagine if a kid put that in the ePortfolio and they see the progression? Now there are some kids, always wanted to be a doctor, and when they're finally a neurosurgeon, see history, it's all there. This is my whole timeline, right? And other kids, well, I started out wanting to be this and wanted to be that, did a little bit of this. I think it'd be amazing. So the ePortfolio could be this amazing tool that you can go back and take a look at your journey. And I know I'm going to defer to my longitudinal study candidates, my older son and my younger son. My older son, ePortfolio is still up. My younger son has his down. He has his business site up. But my older son has gotten some sponsorship, and he's gotten some support. He's gotten some positions and some other things, because different people look back and they read an essay he wrote when he was 11 years old or 12 years old or something like that. And they see character, they see evidence of stick-to-itiveness as a younger child. And then as a young man, or as a young as a teenage man, he's got that same nature. And so they're looking at, I'm investing not just in a guy who's fast, but I'm investing in a guy who's responsible and a guy who really believes in certain things, right? So the ePortfolio can be this tool that can really show other people, an advisor at a university, a potential employer, this is who I am, right? And you know what? This is where I started, and here's part of my journey, and this is where I am now. And you know what? I'm not really sure exactly where I'm going to be next, but it's going to be good, and I'm here to help. Like you can look forward to the future. So yeah, I think wonderful tool. Anything that puts you into that reflective state, I think is phenomenal.
And Dr. H, something that you just said, you just kind of clicked with me, and I just wanted to say this. I think that all of this work is this consistency. Just us trying to implement, this ePortfolios on just 6th grade, or perhaps just with an engineering club, or just with kindergarten, it has an effect. But if you actually build something with consistency, where students actually start at the early age and move on, it just kind of develop that sense of understanding who they are. As an adult, we can do that activity of who I am. And perhaps I will do that 1 or 2 or 3 times in my life. But just bringing the consistency of this process would be something that is really it makes it really meaningful.
I think you've really struck on something very, very important. And there is something called the compounding principle. Is that so? The math people in the room, help me out here. I know compounding interest, but there's a compounding principle. So not only consistency, but if you start early, and if you do a little bit on that consistent basis, it's going to grow into something very, very significant. And so, yeah, I agree. It's consistency. And when we think of discipline, discipline isn't necessarily, treating somebody out. Discipline, if you think of it from an athletic perspective, is having that capacity to do those consistent small things on a regular basis. So some of the best athletes are the ones who were doing those consistent small things, right? Michael Jordan, remember, he was not great in high school, but kept on shooting hoops, right? So you've got lots of examples of professional athletes who, through that consistency and that extended duration, repetition over time, right? Good old Anders Ericsson, deliberate practice, right? That makes all the difference in the world, and establishing those patterns. So as an adult, I think that's kind of sobering, right? So as an adult, we'll do it once or twice, but if we start early, and if we can get kids like middle school, I think middle school is a key point, and if you look at the literature on development, middle school is a really tough age. Kids are really finding an identity, and there's weird things going on, and the hormones are taking off, and all that stuff, right? And so maybe getting them at the end of elementary to start building that, and then who knows, maybe something like that regular reflection, that regular journaling, that regular, self analysis and identifying where I am, who am I now, right? And doing that over a long term might help some students, deal with the ups and downs of being a teenager, right? I think it has amazing potential. Oh yeah, boy, you got me dreaming here. I'm thinking, also have me scheming about something. Some of the future students I'm gonna attribute some activities that I'm coming up with to this conversation. So I'll be pointing to this video and saying, blame them. No, I'm just joking.
Yes, and I think that this is all the questions that we have for the part one. At this time, we can do a quick break, unless there's anything else that, Colby, Allison, you still want to ask regarding this part of the topic. And then we are going to jump on our part number two, which is going to be based more into COBA and blended learning.